Hey darling, it's research time. I know you've been really eager to learn about EFT, and you know how much I love research and spent the better part of a decade working on this PhD that was expensive and time consuming because I love research and I love statistics, but you don't love research and you don't love statistics. So I figured we could have a little bit of an arrangement here. I can do this slog and look through all these EFT studies and find all the best bits so that you can learn EFT, I can geek out, and more importantly, I can talk about EFT however long I want. That's not 10 o'clock at night when you're literally falling asleep on the couch. So let's go. Today's article I wanted to tell you about was published in 2020 by Weisel and colleagues in the journal Family Process. It's about vulnerability in couples therapy, which clearly we know this is really important to help partners become more vulnerable with each other. But these authors took a really cool twist on it. How accurately can both partners perceive the other's level of vulnerability in couples therapy sessions? And more importantly, I think, how does that relate to how well they feel their problems were resolved in that session? These authors used a well-known and well-researched data set that used 36 adult heterosexual couples that were mostly white, mostly had a college education, mostly had about 1.8 kids, and were on average about 44 years old. So the thing to know about these couples is they were in a pretty rough place when they first started the couples therapy. These couples had been struggling for at least 2 years with an emotional injury that they couldn't resolve. And they were given 10 to 12 sessions of emotion-focused therapy for couples. Okay, so here's where we start to get a little researchy. I'm going to try to break it down. I'm going to go slow while not being so indulgent, but it's going to take a lot out of me to try to rein it in and give you the most important pieces. But here it goes anyway. It pains me to say I'm cutting corners. I'm leaving out nitty-gritty details here. But I know that you don't care about those nitty-gritty details, so I'm just going to keep it to the bare minimum of what I think will be helpful for you to understand this. And it pains me, but I'm going to do it. So these couples, after every session, completed a bunch of questions, but these authors only used 10 of those questions. The first 3 questions were about how emotionally vulnerable was I? The next 3 questions was, how emotionally vulnerable did I see my partner? And then the last 4 questions were, how resolved do we feel things are after this session? What's really cool about this kind of data and this kind of study design, now they could compare both partners' perceptions of their own vulnerability to their perceptions of each other's vulnerability. So that's really interesting. They can compare those differences. The authors did a really cool statistical analysis that, again, I really want to tell you about, but I'm not going to. So to describe this, remember, we got to know a little bit about the data, understand what we can take away from the data. So I'm going to draw it out here to make it easy. So here's a dot, boop. So now imagine that this dot is one partner's rating of the other partner's vulnerability. Imagine that there is 10 to 12 of these, boop, 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 across the treatment. So now we can make an average of that. On average, how vulnerable are they perceiving the other partner? However, the other partner rated their own degree of vulnerability. So that's like another series of dots, boop, 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 boop. And that would understandably differ probably from the other partner's ratings of their vulnerability. There's a difference between that, like kind of how generally off the perceiver is from the truth of how vulnerable the partner was. So the authors found something really interesting that makes sense for couples struggling in their relationship. The difference between the perceived vulnerability and the truth of the vulnerability showed that the perceivers tended to see their partners as less vulnerable than they actually were overall. The authors called this the negativity bias. They explained that maybe because there's stress and tension and hurt and pain in the relationship, there's this kind of pull downward in seeing their partner overall as less vulnerable than they actually are. And another thing that was really interesting is the perceiver of vulnerability tended to also be biased by how vulnerable they saw themselves in the session. So I saw myself as really vulnerable in the session. I was more likely to also see you as more vulnerable in the session. They call this the projection bias, where the person projects out onto their partner their own vulnerable state. They assume, oh, I was vulnerable, you were also vulnerable. I wasn't as vulnerable, you also weren't as vulnerable. The other thing though, in general, the partners could perceive when partner's vulnerability did go up or down from their average level of vulnerability. So let's say, okay, partner B was reporting on the truth of their vulnerability, and that has an average overall how vulnerable I see myself across therapy. And I will have deviations up and down. Sometimes I will be more vulnerable than usual. Sometimes I'll be less vulnerable than usual. The authors also found that the perceivers could track those deviations from the partner's average level of vulnerability. They could perceive, oh, hey, my husband or my wife is being more vulnerable than usual today. I see that. Or my husband, wife is being less vulnerable than usual today. That's the tracking accuracy. So in general, couples could tell when there was changes around their average level of vulnerability. That's a good thing. That's attunement from one partner to the other. Really the climax of this paper, and the main thing that I think is important to know, is all in this graph. I'm sure this is just too much to look at, but I'm going to help you understand this because I love slogging through stuff like this. And I'm just going to tell you what this means so you don't have to go get a PhD as well to understand this. The important thing to know about this graph is it's about 3 variables that they measured. It's the 3 sets of questions: how I perceived your vulnerability, how you perceived your own vulnerability, and then how resolved things felt in that session. I'm going to break it apart piece by piece to understand these kind of key spots on the graph that I think are important. For ease sake, I'm just going to talk about this as if it was you and me. Let's start over here on the back right corner. If you were being more vulnerable than usual, if I was totally not attuned to you, I got it totally wrong, and I thought you were being closed off and less vulnerable than usual, ouch, something about that doesn't go well. And that would make sense that there's less resolution reported after those sessions. Okay, now look at the bottom middle of this graph. If you were less vulnerable than usual, and I could accurately tell that you were also being less vulnerable than you usually are, it wasn't as bad. We actually could have reported some degree of resolution. Not a whole lot of resolution, but some degree of resolution. That's like where it was accurate. I accurately saw you as less vulnerable than you usually are. That's a certain amount of attunement. Okay, that's good. Now I'm going to go all the way to the top middle here, because this is also an expected finding. If I saw you as much more vulnerable than you usually are, and you were much more vulnerable than you usually are, that's where we both reported the highest levels of resolution. But this left side of this graph shows something really, really interesting and a fun, surprising finding of this study. If you reported being less vulnerable than usual, and I actually got it wrong and assumed you were much more vulnerable than usual, we still reported some degree of resolution in the session. And now that's fascinating. That's a way where if you get it wrong in this way, if someone overestimates how vulnerable their partner was when they were really less vulnerable than usual, it didn't really matter. It's like that was still okay. But if you underestimate how vulnerable someone was and they really were actually pretty vulnerable, they're going to feel less resolved. So this is a surprising finding. It doesn't mean you always have to get it right, but there's something about getting it right in the positive that I think maybe this means assuming the best of your partner, putting out some sort of vibe that I see you as trying to be vulnerable. Maybe I'm just behaving in a warm way to you. Something about that, even if you weren't as vulnerable, helped our resolution to a degree. Sure, it was misattuned, so it didn't get to like great levels of resolution, but it still wasn't bad. So that's a really surprising finding and something I thought would be really fun to know. So let's talk about caveats to this whole thing. Because look, this paper addresses one little slice of how accurately, for the most part, couples perceive each other's vulnerability seems associated with levels of resolution in that session. Resolution in couples therapy is due in part to this. This is one part of the pie, but there's other parts of the pie that are also really important. Maybe as you put all that together, then it'll help resolution overall. Hopefully this makes sense, and I'm going to drive home now and tell you all about this in even more detail in about 30 minutes, and please let me know how I can help with dinner. All right.